Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So there's a feel-good story in West Virginia, kind of feel good, in West Virginia. And the story is emblematic on why plutocrats and people with means greatly dislike unions. But at the same token, it's also why you, as a worker, or you as somebody who's not necessarily in that top 1%, should appreciate their role in our society. It's diminished as it has become. West Virginia teachers went on strike. Their biggest complaints: we're not getting paid enough, and we're being gouged from the standpoint of healthcare. Our Obamacare is too damn high. After walking out for the past 4 days, Governor Jim Justice has decided to come to the bargaining table, and they've agreed on a 5% increase and creating some kind of commission to discuss or come up with ways of getting down healthcare costs. I don't often hear as much about labor as I think it as strong as labor used to be, because let's be honest, they've been diminished greatly. This is not a situation where you have a political party that's fused to labor, meaning that whatever actions labor take, they can be focused through the lens of a political party. That hasn't been the case for a very, very long time. Labor, for the most part, has been left to its own devices and has withered on the vine because of it. At one point, they could say that they had some kind of tangential association to the Democratic Party. So you had this edifice of the government itself that was working in coordination with elements of the labor movement. You can't really say that now. You have two parties that are beholden to plutocrats. And even when labor pushes and bitches and moans and does whatever it needs to do to get that particular Democrat elected, it doesn't really matter. Ultimately, Democrats understand that labor, for all of its protestations, has nowhere else to go. And so it's not a co-equal partner. It's not a situation like maybe in the 50s or 40s or 60s where the labor movement worked in coordination with the Democratic Party. It's become something fundamentally different. Republicans are insane. Republicans are batshit crazy. Republicans will actively go after you in order to destroy you. We will be apathetic towards you so you can bask in our apathy. And because we understand that apathy is a little bit better than somebody actively going after you, they take apathy as love. They take apathy as affection. And in doing so, they allow themselves to be somewhat undermined. Now, it's logical for why they're being undermined in this way, meaning it makes sense why you would say, this other person hates my guts, this other person is apathetic towards me, I go with the person who's apathetic towards you. The problem with this is, when you don't have anybody to back you up, once a Republican gets in office, they go after you, and they've been going after you over and over and over again. And not having somebody in your corner in the political apparatus, you don't necessarily have the means to recover the ground that you lose. Meaning it's a consistent war of attrition. You just lose and lose and lose, as there's nothing to back you up in order to help you make any gains. That's the point I'm trying to get at. They don't have anything in the political apparatus, their system, and their affairs. Ultimately, they're left to their own devices. So I like hearing stories where labor fought back, and in this case, labor won. Good job, West Virginia. And to give you a little bit more context on why these guys are protesting, West Virginia is one of the poorest states. I knew that just from the Joe Manchin race. But beyond it being one of the poorest states, understand the situation to which we find ourselves. This is one of the states in the United States, one of the richest countries on the planet in the history of the world, to be honest. West Virginia was coal country, and to some degree it still is coal country. Many of those guys worked and had families all through these ideas of the coal mines. This is a grimy job. That being said, it was the job, and it was one of the main centers in regards to coal and energy production in the United States. That being said, West Virginia is also one of the poorest states, if I'm not mistaken, like the 47th, 48th in regards to one of the poverty of all the states in the United States. That is a magnificent juxtaposition. Certainly, there were some people who got magnificently wealthy off of the money from the coal and energy production in West Virginia. It just so happened wasn't the people themselves of West Virginia. So doing this particular dirty industry, this industry that's externalizing all sorts of costs, even on the individuals themselves that feel obliged to work into this particular field because they want to provide for their family, or this is the job that they've been accustomed to doing. In any of these cases, even the cost to them, whether you want to talk about black lung, whether you want to talk about some of the conditions that are associated with working in the mines in the way that these guys work in the mines. What it feels like is West Virginia gave of itself to the rest of the United States in a sense of energy production. And the United States said, thank you, and then turned its back on West Virginia once it no longer wanted to use coal. The resources of West Virginia in many parts, or some parts, should have went to West Virginia itself. In the same way, there was some plan that Sarah Palin or somebody else in Alaska put through that would give some of the oil revenue back to the people of Alaska. Something similar should have done in West Virginia. In fact, I would make the case that it should have been done all across the United States. If you're going to use the resources of the United States, the people of the United States should receive a kickback for those resources. It should not be allowed for them to be able to privatize public resources and public land in the way that they do so. If that land indeed belongs to the public, the people themselves should not be allowed to sell that stuff to private and corporate interests. West Virginia should not be in the straits that West Virginia is in. And there should not be a situation where West Virginia has to fight and bitch and moan just to get a pay increase. Shouldn't have to do that. And one last point on this before I go to this. There's also a 3% increase for other public sector workers. This is one of the benefits of unions. Now, it must be understood, this idea of class, regardless of what they say, meaning regardless of what you learn in school, regardless of what you see when you're looking at the news and the media and what politicians say out of their mouths, never believe that all of our interests are the same. There is a fundamental difference between your interests as a worker, somebody within the 90%, versus somebody who's in the top 1%. Those interests do not necessarily coincide with one another. Same thing, there is a fundamental difference between your interests versus the interests of Obama or Trump or Bush or any of these guys. There is a fundamental difference in those things. Regardless of what they say, you can't necessarily make the assumption that when they're talking about forward and progress and everything else that they're talking about you. They're talking about people like them. Those conversations are for people like them and people in the room with them. Those conversations are not necessarily for you. Labor tries to be a balance. Labor tries to be the force that organizes workers and organizes the regular person in order to push back against, for all intents and purposes, what amounts to exploitation of the population. That raise that took place wasn't just for the teachers union themselves, meaning it wasn't just for the people who were striking and who were pushing back. It was for everybody. This is kind of what I'm getting at about unions in a roundabout way. Their actions, the things that unions pushed for, the things, these guys were beaten and killed in some of these cases. This push from the standpoint of workers that have been suppressed throughout history, in particular the history of the United States, these violent labor strikes and violent labor movements. And not the labor movements themselves, the forces the capitalist class used against those labor movements. That's what I'm talking about in the sense of violence. Their gains have been for all of us, not just for the labor unions themselves. Yes, it was the Teachers Association that took those actions, but everybody got an increase, meaning from the standpoint of public sector. And just to nail that down, make sure I'm saying this properly. Yeah. Teachers and school personnel will receive a 5% raise next year, he said, and all other state employees will get a 3% increase. Their actions affected everybody, not just them. You see this all throughout the society itself, meaning the 8-hour workday, the weekends, the workers' protections that you have in this country. Those things came from organized labor pushing against the political apparatus and pushing against these forces that for all intents and purposes want to try to get as much as they could possibly get. Good job, West Virginia. So, West Virginia salaries, I know what I was getting at before I made it somewhat of a detour. West Virginia, they should not be left in the lurch in the way that they've been left in the lurch by the larger society. Should not have been. If we're going to tell West Virginia that you're now, thank you for your services, thank you for making sure that we have energy production across the United States, but you're doing a dirty industry now, so we don't necessarily like that particular dirty industry, so we're going to move on to other things. You can understand why West Virginia would get more conservative, correct? I mean, you have Republicans saying that climate change doesn't exist. You have a job that these guys are doing that they've made their well-beings with. They have wife, they have kids, they have jobs, they have cars, they have responsibilities and engagements and the things that they need to do in order to make a life. And you're telling them that the thing that you're doing to make your life is no longer something that we as a country would like you to do. We need you to stop doing that. But again, you telling them to do that is undermining what they consider to be a life. It undermines what they do as work. You can understand why West Virginia will get more conservative if you have one party being on board with keeping things as status quo, even though it's a dying industry, to keep it as status quo, and the other industry or the other party who's saying we need to get rid of this. You can kind of understand why they would get more conservative. It's not so much that they care saying fuck the environment. It just so happens that they have a natural incentive of we want to maintain our jobs, we want to maintain our standard of living. So I don't necessarily fault them for that. The problem here is that they're never given an actual path in order to do that. Meaning if the government and the country itself says we want to move on from coal, you need to give them a path for people who are in that industry, who worked in that industry, so they're not necessarily harmed by the country deciding to move forward. But they never do that. And because they never do that, West Virginia tends to trend further and further to the right, because it is the right wing that says we're going to maintain coal and we're going to keep this in office and keep this in effect. Let's take a look at this for a moment. Despite West Virginia providing energy resources to the country, West Virginia is like one of the poorest states. I think it's like 48th poorest. West Virginia teachers, this is CNN, while West Virginia teachers on strike, take a look at their salaries. When it comes to teacher salaries, West Virginia ranks 48th in the nation, according to the National Education Association. And it's one of only 5 states where teacher wages actually went down between 2015 and 2016. That would explain why nearly 20,000 teachers and about 13,000 school service attendant personnel are battling the government for better benefits and higher pay. Think about that. Their wages in 2015 and 2016, where everyone kept telling me that the economy is just ticking along, like that everything is great, and Obama is running on his record and talking about hope and change and all this other stuff, their wages went down. Their wages went down. It took their wages to go down, not even just being stagnant. They were willing to just maintain status quo. It took their wages to actually take a hit. It took them to dealing with being the 48th ranked in regards to pay before they finally did some kind of action in order to try to push back against this. Whatever. I'll take it. I'll take it. And they need to be somewhat of an example that when people push back, you have dollars or you have pitchforks. In this case, they bought the pitchforks. They bought the pitchforks. You can make a case that say they should have pushed for more and all this other stuff, but at the end of the day, they pushed hard and they made gains. And the gains wasn't just for them. The gains was for all of the public sector workers. Good job, West Virginia. Tip of the hat. Good job. All right, I will end it here. All right, guys, if you enjoy the content, feel free to share.